Get your hands off that champagne tray before you break something else, you clumsy old woman. The words cracked across the marble ballroom of Somerset Manor like a whip. 200 guests turned. Crystal glasses froze midair. And in the center of it all stood a 58-year-old housekeeper named Margaret Doyle, her tray trembling in her hands, her cheeks burning with a humiliation she had carried silently for 15 years. What none of the guests in that room knew, what not even the woman screaming at her knew, was that, in exactly 11 minutes, a lawyer would walk through those double doors carrying a sealed envelope that would change who actually owned every single brick of that mansion. Before we continue, if you believe that true worth is never measured by a job title or a bank account, hit that like button, drop a comment with the word GRACE, and subscribe to the channel. Because tonight's story is one you will want to watch until the very last second. Margaret Doyle had not always worn a gray housekeeping uniform. 30 years ago, she was Margaret Whitfield, the only daughter of Charles Whitfield, a self-made real estate developer who built Somerset Manor from an empty stretch of Connecticut farmland into one of the most exclusive private estates on the East Coast. Charles adored his daughter, and everyone assumed that one day, the manor, the vineyards, and the family's holding company would belong to her. But life inside a wealthy family is rarely as simple as an outsider imagines. When Margaret was 28, she fell in love with a landscape architect named Thomas Doyle, a kind, hardworking man with calloused hands and no family fortune to his name. Her father's business partner, a sharp and ambitious man named Richard Sinclair, saw the marriage as a threat to the empire he had spent years quietly maneuvering to control. Richard was not blood family, but he had wormed his way so deeply into Charles Whitfield's trust that he handled contracts, trusts, and legal documents almost entirely on his own. 2 years after Margaret married Thomas, her father suffered a sudden stroke. He survived, but he was left unable to speak clearly or review documents on his own. Richard Sinclair took full advantage of that window. Using a series of manipulated paperwork and a version of the family trust that Charles never fully understood he was signing, Richard restructured ownership of Somerset Manor and the Whitfield Holding Company almost entirely into his own name, with only a small minority share left for Charles. Margaret was cut out completely. When she confronted Richard, he smiled the same calm, practiced smile he always wore in boardrooms. "Your father wanted stability, Margaret, not a daughter chasing romance with a gardener." He made it sound like protection. It was theft. Devastated and unable to prove what had happened, Margaret made a painful decision. Rather than spend her life fighting a legal war she might never win, she walked away. She and Thomas built a small, humble life 2 hours away, raising their son Daniel on love instead of luxury. Margaret never told her son the truth about the mansion, the fortune, or the betrayal. She wanted him to grow up proud of what they earned honestly, not bitter about what was stolen. Then, 7 years ago, Thomas passed away from a sudden illness, leaving Margaret a widow raising a teenage son alone on a modest income. It was around that time that Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She applied for a housekeeping position at Somerset Manor, the very estate her father had built, now run by Richard Sinclair's son, Bradley Sinclair, and his glamorous young wife, Victoria. Margaret told herself it was simply a steady paycheck close to home. But in her heart, she knew the truth. She needed to walk those halls again. She needed to feel close to her father's memory, to the gardens he had planted with his own hands, even if it meant scrubbing floors in a house that legally should have been hers. No one at Somerset Manor recognized her. Charles Whitfield had passed away quietly years earlier. The old staff had long since retired or moved on. To the Sinclair family and their glittering circle of friends, Margaret Doyle was simply the housekeeper, polite, invisible, and beneath their notice. Somerset Manor was hosting its 75th anniversary gala, a lavish celebration marking 3/4 of a century since the estate was first built. Ironically, it was a celebration of Charles Whitfield's original vision, hosted by the very man whose father had stolen it from his daughter. Victoria Sinclair, Bradley's wife, had spent nearly a year planning the event. She wanted Somerset Manor featured in every glossy lifestyle magazine on the East Coast. Diamonds, imported flowers, a 12-piece orchestra, and champagne towers filled the ballroom. Victoria floated through the crowd in a shimmering gold gown, greeting senators, celebrities, and business moguls with practiced charm. Victoria had two things she valued above almost everything else: appearances and control. And that night, both were about to be tested by an ordinary staff member she barely acknowledged existed. Margaret had been asked to help serve drinks during the cocktail hour, since the catering company was short-staffed. She moved quietly through the crowd, careful and precise, the way she had trained herself to be for 7 years. She recognized several old family portraits still hanging on the walls, paintings her own father had commissioned. She recognized the garden visible through the tall windows, the one Thomas himself had helped redesign decades ago before anyone knew who he would one day marry. The memories ached, but Margaret kept her composure as she always did. Then disaster struck in the most ordinary way. A guest, laughing loudly at his own joke, stepped backward without looking and bumped Margaret's tray. A single glass of red wine tipped and splashed across the hem of Victoria's gold gown. The ballroom's chatter dimmed instantly as Victoria let out a sharp gasp. "Do you have any idea what this dress cost?" Victoria snapped, whirling around, her face flushed with fury. "This is a custom Parisian gown, you imbecile." "I'm so sorry, ma'am," Margaret said gently, already reaching for a cloth napkin. "Let me help clean that immediately, and I promise the hotel will cover the cleaning cost." But Victoria wasn't interested in an apology. She was interested in an audience. Cover the cost. Victoria laughed bitterly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "You couldn't afford to cover the cost of the thread on this dress. People like you shouldn't even be allowed near people like us." A few guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to intervene. Others simply looked away, uncomfortable but silent. The same paralyzed silence that so often protects cruelty at the top of a room. Margaret lowered her eyes and said nothing more, choosing dignity over defense just as she always had. But Victoria wasn't finished. "You know what? Take off that stupid apron," Victoria snapped, grabbing at the strap of Margaret's uniform. "If you're going to embarrass me at my own event, you shouldn't even be wearing our staff colors." Margaret stepped back instinctively, but Victoria yanked harder, and the seam of Margaret's uniform tore loudly at the shoulder. Buttons scattered and rolled across the polished marble floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several phones quietly rose to record the moment. "Get your hands off that champagne tray before you break something else, you clumsy old woman," Victoria hissed, shoving Margaret backward toward the kitchen doors. "You need to learn your place. Get out of my sight." Margaret stood frozen for a moment, clutching the torn fabric at her shoulder, tears burning in her eyes that she refused to let fall. She thought of her father. She thought of the gardens Thomas had planted. She thought of everything that room had once meant to her family and everything it had since taken away. She said nothing. She simply turned and walked quietly toward the kitchen, her head still held high. What Victoria did not know, what nobody in that ballroom knew, was that 11 minutes earlier, an elderly attorney named Walter Graham had arrived at Somerset Manor's front gate. Walter had been Charles Whitfield's personal lawyer decades earlier, before Richard Sinclair maneuvered his way into controlling the family's legal affairs. After Richard passed away the previous winter, his private files had finally been transferred for estate settlement, and buried deep within an old fireproof safe, Walter's legal team discovered something extraordinary. The original, unaltered version of Charles Whitfield's family trust, dated years before the version Richard Sinclair had filed. The real trust stated clearly, in Charles Whitfield's own handwriting and legally notarized signature, that Somerset Manor and 60% of the Whitfield holding company were to pass directly to his daughter, Margaret Whitfield, upon his death, regardless of marital status or any later amendments. The version Richard filed decades earlier had never been legally valid. It had simply gone unchallenged because no one with the resources or knowledge had ever come forward to contest it. Walter Graham had spent months quietly verifying the documents, tracking down Margaret's whereabouts, and preparing for this exact moment. He chose the 75th anniversary gala deliberately, the largest public gathering the estate had held in a decade, to formally and publicly restore what had been legally hers for over 20 years. He walked through the ballroom's grand double doors just as the last murmurs about the torn uniform were still rippling through the crowd. "Good evening," Walter said, his voice calm but carrying easily across the stunned room. "My name is Walter Graham, and I am the executor of the original Whitfield Family Trust. I apologize for interrupting your celebration, But I believe there is someone here tonight who deserves to know the truth about who this house has legally belonged to for the past 23 years. Bradley Sinclair stepped forward nervously. I'm sorry, sir, there must be some mistake. My father held full ownership of. Your father held a fraudulent version of a trust that was never legally valid, Walter said gently but firmly. The true, notarized trust names Charles Whitfield's daughter as the rightful majority owner of this estate. A wave of confused whispers spread through the ballroom. And where, Walter continued, might I find Margaret Whitfield? The room fell into stunned silence. Then from near the kitchen doorway, a soft, trembling voice answered, I'm here. Every head turned. Margaret stood in the doorway, still wearing her torn housekeeping uniform, Thomas's old cardigan now draped hastily over her shoulder by a kind young busboy who had seen what happened. Her eyes were red, but her posture was steady. Gasps rippled through the crowd as understanding dawned. The clumsy old woman Victoria had just humiliated in front of 200 guests was not simply a housekeeper. She was Margaret Whitfield Doyle, the rightful owner of Somerset Manor. Victoria's face drained of all color. Her gold gown suddenly felt small against the weight of 200 staring eyes. That's not possible, she stammered. She's the housekeeper. She cleans the guest bathrooms. She is the granddaughter of the man who built the ground you are standing on, Walter said quietly. And as of tonight, legally, this entire estate belongs to her. Bradley Sinclair looked physically ill. He turned toward his wife with an expression of horror and disbelief, realizing in an instant the magnitude of what she had just done, publicly torn the uniform, and humiliated the true owner of their family's entire fortune, in front of every important guest they had spent a year trying to impress. Victoria's practiced charm crumbled completely. Margaret, I didn't know. I would never have. Would never have what? Margaret asked softly, her voice steady despite the tremble still lingering beneath it. Would never have humiliated me if you'd known who I was. That's precisely the problem, Victoria. Cruelty should never depend on someone's bank account. The ballroom was utterly silent. Several guests who had laughed a long minutes earlier now stared at the floor in shame, their phones lowered. Bradley stepped forward, his voice shaking. Margaret, please, I had no idea about any of this. My father never told me the trust was fraudulent. I swear to you, I believe you, Bradley, Margaret said gently. I don't believe you knew, but knowing now, I hope you understand why I can't simply walk away from what's rightfully mine any longer. In the days that followed, headlines across Connecticut and New York carried the extraordinary story. The humble housekeeper who was secretly the true heir of Somerset Manor. Video clips of the torn uniform and Victoria's cruel words spread rapidly online, sparking outrage across social media. Victoria Sinclair's design and lifestyle brand, built almost entirely on her curated image of elegance and grace, collapsed within weeks as sponsors quietly withdrew their partnerships. The very public image she had spent years crafting now stood in humiliating contrast to the viral video of her tearing a widow's uniform and screaming at her to know her place. Margaret, now legally recognized as majority owner of Somerset Manor and the Whitfield Holding Company, faced an important decision. Her lawyers urged her to immediately evict the Sinclair family and sell off the estate's remaining assets. Reporters expected a dramatic, satisfying revenge story, but Margaret chose a different path. She called a private meeting with Bradley Sinclair without Victoria present. She explained that while she intended to reclaim rightful control of the company her father built, she had no desire to destroy Bradley's life over his father's sins. Your father wronged me terribly, Margaret told him. But you didn't write that trust. You were a child when it happened. I won't punish you for a crime you didn't commit. Instead of a hostile takeover, Margaret restructured the company's leadership, keeping Bradley on in a reduced operational role while she personally took over as chairwoman, dedicating a significant portion of the estate's future profits to a new initiative, the Whitfield Doyle Family Scholarship Fund, providing full college scholarships for the children of hospitality and household staff across Connecticut, the very kind of workers who, for decades, had been unseen and undervalued by the wealthy families they served. As for Victoria, Margaret did not pursue legal action, despite her lawyer's strong recommendation. Humiliating her the way she humiliated me won't undo what happened, Margaret said quietly during a rare interview. It will only prove that I learned nothing from the years I spent choosing dignity over revenge. Still, Bradley and Victoria's marriage did not survive the scandal. Unable to cope with the loss of status and public embarrassment, Victoria left Somerset Manor for good just weeks later, her reputation forever tied to the viral video that had once seemed, to her, like just another ordinary night of asserting control. 6 months later, Somerset Manor hosted another gala, this time a scholarship fundraising dinner celebrating the estate's first group of staff family recipients. Margaret stood at the podium, no longer wearing a gray uniform, but a simple, elegant navy dress, her son Daniel seated proudly in the front row, finally learning the full truth of his mother's extraordinary strength. "For 7 years, I cleaned the floors of this house without anyone knowing it was legally mine," Margaret told the crowd, her voice calm and clear. "I want you to understand something important. I was never ashamed of that uniform. I was proud of every honest hour of work it represented. The only thing that ever needed to change wasn't my job. It was the way some people chose to treat someone wearing it." The room rose in a standing ovation. Margaret Doyle never sought revenge. She sought something far more powerful, the chance to prove that dignity cannot be stripped away by cruelty, and that true legacy isn't measured by what a person inherits, but by what they choose to do with it once it's finally, rightfully, returned to them. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes kindness is stronger than status, and subscribe so you never miss another story like this one. Before you go, tell us in the comments. If you had been a guest in that ballroom the night Margaret's uniform was torn, would you have stayed silent, or would you have spoken up? Wealth can build mansions, but only character can build a legacy worth protecting. And sometimes, the person everyone overlooks in the room is the very person holding everything together.